Hello and welcome back to Parley, the series where you folks support the other stuff I make by forcing me to talk about the question of your choice every month for money. This month, Liliana has chosen okay, the French government banning gamer words. Lamau. Let me explain like what actually though. It's not like if you say esports on the streets of France, you get cuffed and put in prison. That's obviously not a thing. This is the French government, the culture ministry specifically, the let me reading my notes, the Académie Française. My French is deciding that the government officials cannot use the English versions of these terms. Instead, they stipulate French versions of the terms. So, for example, pro gamer becomes joyeux professionnel. Is that at least an okay facsimile of French? I'm sorry, I'm doing my best. The idea being that this preserves the French language. And we're going to talk about that. We are going to talk about that. So Liliana, I'm going to talk about this a lot more from the perspective of language, basically, the mechanics of language, the way language is formed. I'm not really interested in being a news person. I don't think you should care. I don't want you to care about like just what I think about this. But I am going to talk about language stuff because build crafting the way that we speak by deciding how our society is set up is a thing that is very interesting to me. So how I'm going to do that is by talking about some things for and against doing this. That seems fair. I don't really want you to care what I actually think about them doing this, but it will become blatantly obvious. So I'm not sure it really matters, but anyway, yeah. So I'm going to talk about that. I'd like to give some other examples. I think the specific words people use is something that is complicated. I think it does matter. I think a lot of people think it doesn't matter. I think those people are patently incorrect, and I would like to explain why I think that. I'm not really here to tell you you should or shouldn't agree with me. I just want you to think about it. If I'm correct, then I don't need you to be forced to agree with me. Explaining and having you think about it will just cause my view to be the one you adopt. If you think logically about it and my view makes sense, there's no need to sell you on it. This is my favorite thing about an honest, open-faced discussion, is that you don't have to try to convince anyone. You can just state your views, and maybe, as I talk about this parlay, I will think, that's actually not a particularly good reason to think that. Maybe I'm just wrong. How good that I updated my opinion, because there's no need to die on the hill of your opinions. Looking forward to it. So I quite like this kind of question. Just because I'm saying I don't want you to care about my specific opinion. That doesn't really matter. Doesn't mean I'm not very interested in this general topic. Some of you might know that I majored in English in college, and I was not that kind of English major. I was the other kind of English major. And what I mean by that is I learned by reading all the works in the English literary canon that I think there is no point to the English literary canon. It's pretty much just a history class at that point. I did focus on creative writing, but I still had to take a lot of courses like that. I think that people who like care too much about grammar and stuff like that, it's just not practical. Like there's some value to those things, but there's a time and a place, and I think the people that bring them up pretty much ever don't understand the time and the place. That will come up a lot. We are going to talk about sort of the nature of language and what words mean. It's going to be a ride. Let's go. Okay, so we're going to start with some things for. I know, a little bit weird to start there. Some reasons for, some points in favor of the French government not being able to say the English version of gamer words. So again, remember, this doesn't mean they can't say like gamer words or whatever. It means they can't say the English versions of them. They have to insist on using the French version. And many of them are like literally just the French translation of that English word. Pro gamer is just the pro and gamer in French. Like it's not like a different word as per se. You see what I mean? Of course, some of the time, not every language has a word for every specific thing that is one word. Some of them are a bit more different, but from I skimmed these articles that Liliana linked, they seemed like they were quite straightforward. Like there wasn't much of an agenda in what the French version was in and of itself, only an agenda in like forcing people to use the French version. Okay. So some arguments in favor of that, shall we? I cannot suppress my actual feelings about this. Indeed, some French people might not know what those terms mean and then would know what the French version meant. I don't think that would be a lot of people. The French version still doesn't explain what those things mean. For example, if you say pro gamer but the French version, that still doesn't clarify to people listening what a professional gamer is. How does that work? They still don't know. They just know what the word being said if they don't know the English slang. This is important because the French, cultural ministry's stated reason for doing this is to increase communication, to make it easier for people to communicate. I am going to be arguing when I get to the against part that it literally just objectively doesn't make it easier for people to communicate. Or more to the point, this literally isn't how people communicate. It just isn't. It's not a matter of whether that is or isn't effective. It simply doesn't apply to the subject of communication. But it is definitely true that there will be some existing humans that would not have understood the term when it was said in English and then would understand if that was merely translated into French. Technically, that would help some people understand, I suppose. You could argue, this is the second point, that this is an acknowledgement of gaming. Easy for me to say, an acknowledgement of gaming in France as a major part of society, which obviously it has been for a very long time. But for example, a lot of sports team investors have recently invested in esports teams. This is just a global phenomenon, not in not in French specifically, not in France specifically. Which is not all good, obviously, but it is not all bad. The idea that esports, objectively a large part of the world, are becoming a more mainstream thing isn't bad if we've decided we like esports. Those things being acknowledged is, in theory, good. Maybe esports themselves or sports culture in general is bad, but if esports are a thing a lot of people do, getting there to be investment or whatever is good for the people that apparently a lot of people really like that. It's hard to say that's bad. Likewise, if gaming is a large part of culture in general, French culture, which it is, then it makes sense for there to be a formal acknowledgement of that, some structure around that. I would argue that there's a way in which that could be a gateway to more practical structure for gaming legislation in the future. If it is something that these bodies of government discuss, then that is in theory good in the future. It is in some way a gateway. That is a thing those bodies are discussing. For a simple example of how that might be good, I think like legislating loot boxes, there's a way in which government might just think that's irrelevant to them. But the more there is stuff like this that applies to this type of topic, the more it's something the government is tackling. Which I'm not saying that's all good, but in theory, there are definitely positive effects. Does that make sense? In my opinion, this is probably the most positive point for doing this. And you'll note that it is barely about language. It's just like the government doing anything related to gaming is in theory possibly good, at least partially, which is barely a positive effect of deciding about French gamer terms. But I do think that's related. That is relevant. Okay, using an English version of a term simply because it was created first isn't like particularly a good reason to pick that term. In other words, like just because pro gamer is a term that people started using in a widespread fashion before the French version of that term, the fact that the English term was widespread first is not in and of itself a good reason for us to all say that word. It is how people decide which word to say. Like, that is how people decide. It's just not a good way to decide. It is the way people decide, but there isn't really anything particularly valid about, like, this one just came first. Sure. And indeed, there are times, I'm sure you can think of examples of this yourself, in our culture where the first term used to refer to something was later usurped by one that makes more sense or isn't as culturally loaded, or there's quite a few reasons that might happen. Most of the time, though, it's because the original term is literally unclear. the subject the term refers to evolves to the point where the term doesn't apply anymore, or the term is offensive to a group, and we respect that group more and make the term be something else, or something that group likes. Another, maybe slightly less common but very important version is when a term is offensive to a group, that group co-opts that term, and then it bears a different context than returns. A very simple example is the word queer. Was a slur, but became co-opted by the queer community, and I would argue now has a neutral to positive connotation most of the time. When I say I would argue, I would argue from evidence that is not from my personal experience. But it depends on where you live. I personally negatively associate the term buddy. Where I grew up, how I grew up, people use buddy as a form of, I'm going to say bullying, I guess. It's a way to sort of put the person down and associate yourself with them, sidle up to them. Like, yeah, we're friends and you're, my buddy, pushes your head down, so you're going to go get me like drinks from the vending machine or something. This is not something that happened to me personally that much, but this was the connotation of that term in my life. To me, calling someone buddy is condescending. You're being rude. But I know that that is not that word's connotation most places in the world. For example, Joey Zero says buddy to me, and I know that he doesn't mean it that way. That's just what people say where he's from. So it would be wrong of me to carry my interpretation of that, into my conversation with him. And so, of course, there is also some sanity check acknowledgments for these terms. Like it just literally doesn't have that connotation, and people work to give up their association with it. Cool, or at least they should. So yeah, I mean, sure, having there be, the way that the term is being used, or the fact that the term is created from the English language first, there's nothing like necessarily automatically good about the fact that it's the English one was first or whatever. Again, I would point out as a counterpoint, though, France, that is literally how people decide which words to use. You can't do anything about that. We're going to get into that in a minute. But yeah, like from a technical perspective, you could argue that there are just better terms than others. For example, different languages have words that are more or less advantageous relative to that language, or like mutually understood onomatopoeia, a topic which interests me greatly. So you'll indulge me for just a moment and then we'll move on. For example, I've talked in a previous parlay about how the word intelligence in English is an excellent word. It kind of sounds in some, I would argue, objective way. This Pandora's box that we'll open up some other time, but I think as shorthand, there is some objective way in which the word intelligence sounds like what it is. Like that is good in some way. There are examples of maybe we don't agree with this, but society as a whole thinking this, or thinking that a word has broad utility that goes beyond what culture the word is from, where languages adopt words from other cultures. Again, transitioning into my arguments against doing this, against trying to make a French version of these English terms rather than adopting them, transitioning to that point, all languages do this. And it's not particularly abnormal. A lot of the time it makes a lot of sense. It's just the language adopting a word that maybe they don't even have. And it'd just be the word in the other language is a good word for that thing. So why not use the word? Again, this is all over the place. I think, the English word niche, for example, in English, people often say niche, or in American or European English, but in French, a little bit more like niche. I say niche, but niche is what a lot of people say as well. And I believe this is simply a very good word. Oh my goodness, is that not French? Anyway, you get the point. There are lots of those words that are adapted from different languages. I actually don't. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's just an example. But there are lots of words like that is the point. And they're often very helpful. You could argue from a linguistic buildcraft perspective that there are languages that are literally just overall more or less optimal. For example, this maybe isn't a good look for a video where I'm trying to be reasonable about the French language insisting on its own French words, but I believe that having gender in your language is objectively bad. Like that is a bad thing. It is better to have a language where there isn't as much gender. In French, there is gender. Words have gender. And that's a fairly important part of the language in some way. And I think that is bad. That's just bad. Um, an example of something that I don't think you can say it's just bad, but it does have a lot of consequences, would be the difference between Japanese and English. Japanese has one of the smallest syllabaries of global languages at the moment. What that means is there are very few sounds in Japanese. There's like 50, I think. In English, there's like 3,000 or something. The English has a very large number of them. This has a lot of weird consequences for both languages. This means that Japanese is going to use context a lot because a lot of words sound similar. This means rhyming is like weird, not just worse, but very different in Japanese than in English. It's very easy to rhyme words in Japanese because they end with very few different sounds, and that can be very good. Freestyle rap in Japanese is really, really interesting, a very interesting topic we don't have time for. In English, rhyming feels much more deliberate and obvious, and it's much more obvious when it is or isn't there. Whereas in Japanese, having everything rhyme is less different from normal Japanese. But then that can also mean that you use like a ton of alliteration, which I think is very cool, but that's very subjective. Clearly, neither is literally just better or worse. Like there's really no way to say that. At least I don't think so. In the same way that having gender locked into your language is like probably bad. Again, maybe eliminating gender isn't good. I'm simply pointing out that our views on gender have changed and the French language has it kind of rooted in there. Maybe that's not an advantage, having that be something we were not stuck with. If we change our opinions about it as a society, that's not a bad idea, right? That would be, I would argue, an advantage of a language. This is not to say that having gender in your language itself is good or bad, maybe in theory. It's simply that human society will change what we think about that, and so locking it into the language isn't really good or bad. Blah, blah, blah. My point is, the idea that you're saying like one language has advantages over another is like perfectly valid in theory. I don't know how reasonable it is, though, to say like these words should be the French versions of these words just because French. Like, you see what I'm trying to say? Let's get into some reasons against, and I've already snarkily mentioned a lot of them, so I'm sorry for completely playing my hand. People just literally don't do this. Just because the government says words this way, like I'm confident that most people won't do that. Most people in France and everywhere else will say the word that has been widely adopted. There's quite a few reasons for this. The first reason is that people simply recognize it. A word won't catch on simply because it is stipulated by the government. As a matter of fact, one point against doing this is actually something that you need to agree it was good for the French government to influence people to use words this way. French government, the fact that you're forcing the government to say these words this way may make the words less prominent by causing people to associate them with stuffy government officials. So again, I don't care about that because I don't think this is a good idea. But if you did think this was a good idea, a point against it would be it might actually make it less likely these words will be adopted. Or it will at least have that effect a little bit. Who knows how much? Will it be more than the people just saying the word because that's what they hear? Hard to say. It will probably cause a generational divide where people that are less in tune with the culture as it's evolving in front of them, older people, I hate to say it that way, but it is correlated with older folks, are going to say the French version of the term because they'll hear it first through the government. And the younger folks will say the English version of the term, which again arguably makes people understand each other less than if you didn't force that term on them. Because now not only does neither party have a definition of the term, definitions vary, but like a mutually understood idea of what the other party means about that word. That's what a definition is, because there's no single definition for a word. That's how language works. Not only do you not have that, now the two different groups of people say a different word. So they're even further away from being on the same understanding. I would argue that is bad. Again, I believe strongly that this is a thing that is ignorant of the way that language actually works. There's a quote in one of the articles where they say, it must not be seen as inevitable that the English terms will be adopted. Like, it literally is inevitable. Like that. It's inevitable. You can't what do you mean? You know, I would want to ask those people, but you're aware that it is inevitable, right? Like you can't, it is going to happen. And so what you're doing is just making there be more turbulence in that process. This is a problem. This is something I'm going to get to at the end, but there is a discussion in here about like, should we let culture dissolve in the global information age? I'm not saying that necessarily, just to clarify. I am saying that it will dissolve in the global information age. I'm not trying to say that that's good just because I'm saying that it is inevitable. It is blatantly, obviously inevitable. I think that this actually, in some ways, makes it worse. By having two groups use a separate term, you're actually proving the utility of using the English word in some way. So that's interesting. And I hope you can see how it creates an interesting selection pressure, a divide in some way. I think it's very clear at the very least, the biggest reason against doing this is simply that their stated goal, making people understand each other better, like if anything, it will do the opposite. It will definitely not cause people to understand each other more if you force people to use a term that less people currently use. That just obviously will not increase understanding. That isn't how that works. And again, of course, in the for category, it is technically true that some people will have understood the French version and not the English version. That is true, but they still don't understand the English version. So I don't know. It's hard to know. This is something I'm not linguistically qualified to talk about too much. It's hard to know whether the people who hear the French version understand it and then hear the English version will then connect, oh, that's that word that I know. The degree to which that will happen, depending on the difference between the French and English term, will of course vary. And I'm not familiar with the degree to which folks in France are comfortable with English terms like this. I know that a lot of people in France, from my experience when I've been to mostly Nice, Saint-Tropez, and Paris, and Saint-Tropez and Paris are probably more English than some other places. But Nice, maybe, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but my impression was that a lot of folks in France do have a working understanding of English, but it's very difficult to know about these words, this kind of word, these gaming terms, right? So how often will that cause people to jump over and actually increase their understanding? I believe very little, but it's hard. Like the French ministry also doesn't know that, but they would know better than I would probably. I'm sure they have better, it's still not good, I would argue, but better data about that. I'm sure they would tell you they know for sure. They don't. That's not knowable, but it is a subjective but still quantifiable experience. Um, yeah, what else is there to say? Right. I don't think that the other versions will catch on. I think that there's a way in which not only will it create people actually misunderstanding each other, a lot of younger folks will be saying the English version, and gaming legislation affects them, and the government will insist on not saying the term that those people actually use. This may cause them to be disillusioned and to kind of unplug from politics, which I would argue is probably bad insofar as being heavily involved in politics is not necessarily good, but feeling like politics have nothing to do with you is probably not good. I don't think it's good for politicians to speak in a way that feels irrelevant to the people to whom the thing they are speaking about affects. That seems bad. Yeah. I think that when you use a word, like you say, pro gamer, which is what the kids are saying or whatever, and then people think, oh, they kind of get it. Well, that's bad too, because they totally don't. They're just sidling up to you using lingo, kind of like my complaint about buddy before. It can be a way of not talking down to someone, but creating a false alliance between people. This is, after all, why people use these terms to some extent. People use oversimplified terms for these things instead of explaining them because it makes them sound like a member of a group, which I believe is usually bad. In a situation where you wouldn't simply explain, I'm not sure that that is a situation that leads to good understanding between parties. So I'm not trying to say that it's good if the French government gets in with the kids by using the cool lingo. I don't think that would happen anyway, but it's not that I think that's good. It's simply that it feels like a needless irrelevance to use terms that people that are affected by these things literally don't use. That seems bad for reasons other than just that they will misunderstand each other. The people using the English version of the term will understand the French version of the term because it's literally just the French translation of the English word, right? It's not like a new term. They will understand it and they will think that's not what people say, though, you know? And that unplugging from the discussion does mean that they're like not influencing the politics that affect them as much, which I would argue isn't necessarily good. So that's another bad thing. A lot of bad things, I think. Again, it's pretty clear. I think this is very stupid, but it's understandable why they're doing it. Again, it's very stupid because it won't work. It's not stupid to want culture. I actually don't know what I think about that. Maybe in the future, I will think that is stupid. I think it's futile. I don't think it's like infantile or something. It's just going to fail. Unfortunately, perhaps. I'm not sure. Let's briefly have a discussion about that to close out this parlay. Yeah, I don't think that culture will continue to exist in the previously understood form. I would like to say one more time for the people in the back, I'm not trying to say that's good. I'm just trying to say that is happening, is going to happen, cannot be stopped. Like that isn't a thing that will stop. You could argue that culture is simply transforming. That's an interesting approach. You could argue that French as a language will eventually cease to be as a formal construction. Or maybe it will reach an equilibrium where like people won't not know the languages that are more widespread. I guess at this rate, English, Spanish, and Chinese. I don't know. Anyway, everybody will know those languages or something, but people will locally also still learn that language. It's possible the equilibrium state of our culture will be that there will still be those languages. And again, I'm not really sure. I'm not trying to say whether that is good or bad. Maybe it's just an affectation, needlessly inefficient, to insist on having individual languages now that we've gotten to a point where we're a globalized society. Maybe it's just childish to do that. I'm not really claiming that it is. I'm not sure. This is something I think about a lot. It's going to happen. So I don't know, man, like, what should we do? I don't know. It doesn't seem particularly with it to attempt to pretend that this will not happen. That is silly, I think. It feels quite childish, yes, to say that this must not be seen as inevitable. It's like, do you hear what you're saying? That's like saying it is, we know it is inevitable. Like, I don't know. It's just kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but yeah. So the it really is. Anyway, it's possible that languages locally will or will not persist in 100 more years of globalized society, or we'll all just die and we won't find out. Who knows? But I'm also quite interested in whether, again, it might simply evolve. There is a way in which you could argue currently a lot of video game communities have words that are kind of their non-geographical culture. And that's kind of, you could argue, that's kind of replaced like geographical culture to some extent. A lot of people don't have a geographical culture in any appreciable way. They have a very vague one, but not one that they really identify with. And they do have one that is sort of a found or social culture. There's a big move toward this type of thing in general in the modern age. A lot of found family, for example, and doing it your own way, not keeping your name or maybe assigned gender or etc. that you were given, and instead finding the one that you prefer. That is a common trend in many different interpretations of that idea. I don't think there's any reason to believe that that won't continue to be a common trend. And again, I'm not particularly saying that's good or bad. I think it's mostly good. Fine. But I don't know. I mean, there are unforeseen consequences because we're right in the middle of that right now. I don't know. Anyway, but I don't like a lot of those things either. And so, like, for example, in video games, something I've brought up a lot in previous Parlay and on streams is I don't really like video game genre words. I'd like to briefly conclude by talking about that, as I feel it's related to this. Roguelike, it's a gaming term too. Can the government say roguelike? Yeah, that's a weird one. Anyway, I don't know. That's probably the most interesting question coming away from this parlay. Like, okay, but what about like open world as a video game term? Can the French government say that, or do they have to say the French version of that? That's a to me a weird gray area. I don't know. Probably they do have to say a French version of that. I wonder how extensive this list of things that they have to say in French is. You see what I'm trying to say? Like the Ministry of Culture or whatever for France doesn't understand video games either, probably. So surely they didn't. I don't know. Anyway, goodness, there's a lot of sidetracks in this one. Um, my point is that I don't really like genre words like roguelike, and there's a few reasons. I'll rapid fire them. I believe people think that they're on the same page about what the term means. Most commonly, someone says roguelike and the other person says, yeah. Those two people are assuming that they mean the same thing, but they usually don't, I would argue. Another common supposition is that the people assume, like, okay, but my definition of it is the right definition, which it isn't. That's not how language works. You could look up the definition, and what you'll find are multiple different sources, none of which can be objectified as the correct source, that give you slightly or significantly different definitions. There is not a correct definition. You could argue there is some construct of the correct definition for a roguelike, and that correct definition is a word cloud with bigger words, which are used more often, and smaller words, which are used less often. In this supposition, roguelike doesn't mean games that are like the game Rogue, and it doesn't not mean that. It 20% means that, for example. Sure, if we theoretically had such a thing, which we don't, that would be the definition of that word. And that the size and number of those words would constantly be changing. That living, breathing non-definition would be the definition of the word roguelike. That is what a word's definition actually is. That is why there are different dictionaries, and why a dictionary can be somewhat unhelpful sometimes. Although they do attempt to capture this kind of thing, it's just impossible to completely capture the context of a word, even as it's evolving, and dictionaries take a lot of work, a lot of time to make. So, so that's one element. Roguelike is used, as all these words are, as if it has a single definition, and it doesn't in many ways. It doesn't in practice. It doesn't socially, like the person you're saying it to and you are not somehow automatically on the same interpretation of the word. That's not even possible. And it doesn't, there is no way to quantify a single definition in the first place. Sure. But another reason is that I believe they're often used as kind of shortcuts. Well, a lot of people use the word roguelike as a way to explain their game in a kind of elevator pitch. If you look up what a game is, if I say, what's Hades? You're going to look it up and the word roguelike will come up a lot. And some of you are thinking you're not familiar with this word. A lot of you probably are. Games where you do a run, you get some upgrades, there's some randomness to that run where you try to beat that part of that game, and then you die and most or all of the things reset. Roguelite was originally a term, roguelike, but light, that meant it's a roguelike, but not as much stuff resets when you die, or there's like more progression between runs. Originally, there was this assertion that roguelike meant only games that were pure permadeath. You lose everything when you die, or there's like no advantages when you die. But I believe that the gaming industry discovered that this is simply not a winning strategy. And so that term has kind of fallen out of fashion, as roguelike has become a word that does mean you keep some progression between runs, because players simply like that. It's not because there is or isn't a correct definition. There never was a correct definition. It just evolved to mean that thing. That is how language is created. I'm saying this like you're disagreeing with me, which is a bad habit of mine. But if you are disagreeing with me, that's fine. I hope you're at least listening to my side of it, and you could decide for yourself. Yeah. So I just wanted to conclude with this idea that these terms are always kind of oversimplifications. I'm not sure what to do about that. They increase awareness in some way. They're very viral. They're very memeable. Most people are bad at explaining things. So if they would have failed to explain these words anyway, then isn't them saying the word at all better than like no visibility for the thing? I guess. For example, if you don't have an intimate knowledge of your gender identity or sexual orientation, isn't simplifying it by saying, I'm bisexual, better than not having any way to express it? Yes. Yeah, yes, it is. And it's only for you to know, like, what is the best for you as a way to identify that, of course. This is why we say the pronouns, for example, that people say they want. This is why it is offensive to not call someone by the name they tell you. If I say my name is Xander and you say Alex, that is rude. You call me the name that I said my name is. Just like when you tell me your pronouns, I do my best to use your pronouns. It's an honest mistake, that's one thing, but I do my best to do that because that's what you're picking. And while it is true that you or I might somehow find out that we prefer some other term, that's only our journey. That's not for anyone else to be involved in, of course. But at the same time, there is a way in which there is a rounding that happens. When we use these words, there might be some better way to select for things. And when something like a roguelike that's not someone's identity, it's just an oversimplification. I would argue that if you look at the situations where you need that oversimplification, we would be better off if we eliminated those circumstances. So in other words, you need these terms because otherwise you can't explain what your game is about in like 2 sentences. But you, the consumer, shouldn't want a game to explain what it is in 2 sentences. If we eliminated situations where that was necessary, we would be better off, I would argue. So we can't just drop the term, but I would argue that needing it less is good. Or maybe I could put it a different way. Like it's not bad for if I'm attracted to not particularly men, women, or people identifying their gender another way. I'm not really interested in gender. Isn't having the term pansexual better than having no term for that? And I said, yes, I think it is. But wouldn't it be even better if every time I wanted someone to understand that about me, they sat down and listened to my exact description of what I liked and didn't like about people? Yes, I think that would be better. And situations where I need to oversimplify myself happening less often, would that be good? I think it would. And so I kind of feel this way. I feel like the fact that the French government is now going to say this oversimplification instead of that oversimplification, it's like, ultimately, this cannot possibly make much progress because you would just want to not use those words entirely. You would want to define them as you use them. Maybe you use the word, but then you say that, but what we mean is this, a professional gamer is defined as someone who makes this amount of money, whatever. That's how we're defining it. A lot of the time it's used to mean this, but we're saying it this way. You might think, isn't that a bit stuffy? But look, like it's the government. If anybody is supposed to clarify and have a good reason for why they're doing something, even though they hardly ever do, but it would be good if they did, it would be the government. Like, these are the people who should be forced to do that. I am lucky to have all of you as part of my community where we have time to clarify these things as well, because I do not wish to discuss anything without being able to clarify it. Sometimes I fail to. It's very difficult to unlearn my 29 years of life where everybody around me oversimplified everything. So, I mess up all the time too. I'm sure I did plenty in this video. But it's good to be able to clarify those things. That is a good thing. My biggest argument against doing this is simply that having a word that you use to simplify these things that people are not on the same page about is bad. Changing it from being English to French doesn't make that less bad. So you've made, French versions of words that will definitely not stick. That is not how language works. And it's still very bad. That's still not good. You haven't really accomplished anything by doing that. As usual, I think that is a very out of touch, bad government. There, I said exactly what I think. There you go. Wow, shots fired, bang, bang. Not going to get sponsored by the French Ministry of Culture anymore, am I? But for real, I want to clarify that this is not meant to be an attack on the idea of preserving culture. They're doing it, they say, because they want to preserve the French language. Well, they're saying it will help people communicate, but we all know that's not really why. They're doing it because they want French to be a French language that's French, and they want to have the French national identity. That's obviously really why. We can all read between the lines. And I'm not trying to say that is bad. I'm not sure what we should say about that. French Ministry of Culture, you and I, we don't know what to do about that. You're doing this because you know that this is a thing that is going away, and you're, for whatever reason, making the misguided attempt to stop it from going away. I'm not trying to say that is bad. I'm just saying the thing you've done won't work. Like that's not a thing. That is not good. It doesn't have significant positive effects, I don't believe. But I'm not trying to say that the desire to do it is bad. None of us really know what to say about that. I think it's actually quite interesting to think about that. But what you've done isn't going to make it better. That's what I think. Fantastic question.